Good evening, welcome. This is Beyond the Darkness. I'm your host, Dave Schrader, along with me, Tim Dennis. And this is our second installment as we begin our 5-day-a-week programming here on Podcast One, part of the Jericho Network. Thank you very much for joining us. Here's something really cool. If you like our show, you want to help us to continue, then what we need from you is when you hear the authors and the documentarians and the researchers that are on our show, and you'd like to buy their books, you'd like to buy their DVDs, you'd like to get the information from them. Well, I'm just going to ask you to do me a favor, all right? To keep this podcast going, you can use my Amazon banner when you shop. So a small amount of the purchase goes directly to help support this podcast at no extra cost to you. Here's how you do it. You just go to Podcast One, click on Killer Deals link, then click my show logo. You'll see the little ghost holding the microphone, and you'll see Amazon and all my sponsors. Then, when you click the link, bookmark it so it's super easy to use the next time. It's just a cool way that you can help us keep doing what we do here on Beyond the Darkness, and it will also afford you the opportunity to get all of the great books and all of the great material you hear on our show, which leads us into tonight's show, Mysterious Disappearances, Dark Legends of Elementals and Fairy Folk. Our guest this evening, Steph Young. She's an independent researcher. She's addicted to researching all supernatural, paranormal, esoteric, and enigmatic mysteries. She's been a part of our world in the darkness realm now for a few years. One of our all-time favorite guests, and she particularly likes to write and research about creepy things in the woods, strange encounters in the woods, scary things lurking about in the woods, and that leads us into these mysterious disappearances that have been taking place all over the world. Tonight we're going to take a look at it from a slightly different perspective as we talk about some of the legends and lore, especially in the UK, of the elementals, the fairy folk, and how some people go missing. Steph, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Always great to have you back with us. These disappearances that are happening, they're happening worldwide. They're happening in every culture, every belief system, every aspect of the globe. Just strange, unnatural type disappearances. As you research this, do you find new cases like on a weekly basis? Is it monthly? How often are these bizarre vanishings taking place?
Well, they do seem to be quite often, I would say probably weekly, given that you can look all over the world as well, and you'll find some of these very, very strange cases very easily. So it's not something that sort of happened back in the 1600s and never happened again. It's an ongoing thing, which I suppose is why one of the possibilities that I look into is the elementals or the fae or nature spirits. Last year there were cases in Malaysia where the local people were saying it was the whispering people, and that's who they believe are the elementals who take people when they're in the forest and the woods. So it's not an old-fashioned belief as well. It's something that people would still say could be happening.
When you're researching these mysterious disappearances, are there certain markers you're looking for that fit the parameters of what interests you, as opposed to just everyday people go missing? Every day it happens. How do you differentiate between what you want to really dig deeper into and what you consider just to be an average, everyday, run-of-the-mill, maybe runaway person, adult, child, along those lines?
Well, I suppose normally through newspaper reports you'll find a cause of death. So if it's because they've had a fall or exposure or something really easily explained, then it's not sort of on the sinister or mysterious side, but it's more when they seem to have gone and then perhaps come back at a later stage, and there's not such a clear reason how they died or why they were lost or what happened to them.
Do most of these disappearances that you cover in your research, do they end with a death involved? Is that what kind of brings you into the story? Or, can it also be just they vanish off the face of the earth with no markings, no understanding where they could be? How do you decide on that?
Dave, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your question.
What I was asking is, do the disappearances that you focus on, Are they always ones that end with death, where the body is found and it's under strange circumstances?
Not always, no. And in particular, with some of these cases that we're going to talk about tonight, sometimes they're children or adults, and they're found again, but they've had some really strange experiences that don't seem to sort of make sense to us, but it's almost like they've been whisked away somewhere, and then they come back and they're alive, but they've been to another land.
Another land. And as a researcher, I mean, does that fascinate you, or does it send your BS meter up?
Well, when I start to look, I will be absolutely believing if somebody's telling me, and then I'll sit back and sort of ask questions. So at the moment, I'm talking to a man who lives Louisiana area. He doesn't want me to give his full name, which is understandable, and he's told me that he's been having some very strange experiences since 2011 on his property, which is very rural, and we'll probably get into some of those. So he's told me, but he doesn't really want me to tell who he is. He's not sort of looking for attention or to be having this out in the public. So, and I've asked him an awful lot of questions, and some of the answers are so detailed and intricate, and would take an extraordinarily creative mind to come up with some of these things. And so when people tell me about their experiences, I think it's really important to ask as many questions and sort of sit back and think about it. Perhaps some of them won't all be true, but I don't like to say that they're not. And I also leave it up to the reader or the listener to really make their own mind up. So with the personal accounts, I think in some respects could actually hold a lot more truth than we might realise and, might easily dismiss.
Are there stories that you will get from time to time from experiencers that you do just dismiss because it sounds too out there, or are you truly a librarian? You gather all stories and just present them as they're presented to you and allow people to make that decision on their own? For
the majority, I gather them and yes, put them out there. Some of them I don't, because perhaps they've got a more logical explanation, or they're not. I don't know. They're not quite. They don't sort of fire my imagination up. But for the vast majority, it never fails to surprise me what people send and what they've gone through. I don't know why, but yesterday I was looking at some of the cases, and there was one, a lady and husband have sent me, and I've spoken to them quite a bit, and they're two dogs, German Shepherd dogs, which were actually police dogs. They ran off from a very, very rural area that they'd bought this property. And they came back, and they did it twice, and the dogs disappeared, and both times they came back after 2 days. Now, German Shepherds have got very long hair. Well, it had been raining after they disappeared, and when they ran off, they went to the edge of the land, and there's a cave, and it's a steep drop, and the dogs just went over it. They didn't look back. They wouldn't respond to being called, and they disappeared for 2 days. When they came back, they didn't have a mark of no mud, nothing in their fur, and the owner said, "This is impossible." They would have picked up burrs and things like that, and they were completely pristine. They didn't have any neighbours around for miles and miles, so they just could not understand how the dogs could be gone in mud and rain and come back as if they'd not left the house. And in fact, they moved away from the property because they found it so disturbing. They were worried for their dogs. And so, I get so many accounts, and they're completely baffling. And I don't really think that people have the time to sit there and make things up for the sake of it. Because, again, I have to really coax people to let me share their stories. They're more telling me because they've found somebody who's going to listen and not say, "You're crazy." But they don't necessarily want the stories shared, or they want things kept confidential most of the time.
That, I guess, has always been one of the stranger elements of the supernatural, the idea of the fae, the fairy people, the elementals. again, it sounds so fantastical, and maybe that's because here in the United States, our indoctrination to the fairy realm is Tinkerbell, right? So we get the Disney versions of these characters, and they just seem too impossible and impractical to exist. I know there's a gentleman over in Ireland who's been noted for photographing fairies, and the pictures are very compelling. They're very interesting, and it's hard to just dismiss it. I mean, on the overall, yes, you can say there's some photoshopping going on. There's definitely, some kind of alterations being made. That would be an easy jump. Had I not seen them for myself, Steph, when I went to Ireland a few years ago, we were visiting one of the castles, and we're walking through the courtyard, which had kind of longish grass, and all of a sudden, with the sunlight, all of a sudden there was just this strange mass of fairy creatures. And
where was this?
And I'm trying to remember the name of the castle. It's driving me crazy. I'll get that for you off air.
Yeah.
But here's what I did. I stood there shocked and amazed, and there were a few of us that were lagging behind that watched this dance of these fairies just pop up. And I'm thinking, this is insane. What am I looking at? Mm-hmm. So I started to follow one. And damn, Steph, you see the legs hanging there and their little arms and their wings, and they are exactly what you would expect a fairy to look like until it lands on a rock. And the minute it landed on a rock, I began photographing it. And it was this giant mosquito-looking bug. But the way it was configured, when it would launch itself to fly, its appendages would hang like human arms and legs. And its wings would span out behind it. And when it would fly into the sunlight, so the light came through it, you would see these sparkling little light-up fairies. And I was excited to have kind of debunked it, but I was also a little let down because I just followed these things, and I was tied up in the magic of the moment. I can guarantee you that. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. And then I realize, well, all I'm seeing are bugs. So I can understand how people can think they're seeing, even in 2017, think they're seeing fairies. But it is in fact nothing more than an insect. So that kind of brought me back into it. Now, I thought was really interesting as we're talking to the people in Ireland, and we're there on our tour, which, every year I go to a different country with our listeners. This year we're going to be heading over to England. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that place, Stephanie, but I hear it's great.
I have to come and find you.
They we're going to be going out to England in September. People can go check darknessevents.com or email me, dave@darknessradio.com for more information. That'll be going up for sale here soon. But we go out to all these countries, and we went to Ireland, and they were very kind of dismissive of ghost stories. Although every castle seems to have a ghost or some kind of story, they were not real impressed by that, and they almost kind of laughed at our group for being so interested in that. But yet we had to divert our way around roads because we couldn't go past this fairy bush, or we couldn't go into this area, which was a fairy mound area. And I'm like, wait a minute, you're making fun of us for believing in ghosts, but we have to divert the bus down a different route so we don't cross a fairy mound. And it was to them so real. As a matter of fact, we got out of the bus and there was a fairy bush. You can hang. You were supposed to give little donations, a token of something of yours, and you'd hang it on the bush. And I guess that was to appease the fairy folk. And to me, that was crazy, and has always been kind of one of those outside aspects of the paranormal that have sounded the looniest to me. But man, when you talk to people in Europe and the UK over there, there's really kind of I don't even know, an acceptance, maybe that's the right term, that there is this kind of magical realm around us. Do you find that, or are they just screwing with tourists?
No, I don't think so. Well, there's the Irish Blarney, isn't there? So, the Irish are good at telling tall tales. However, they used to actually kill people. I don't mean in this century, but they used to kill people that they thought, in Ireland, had been turned into changelings. So they thought that the fairies had turned these people into changelings. And they also, I was reading the other day, there was, I go through the old sort of coroner's reports, from different centuries, and you can find accounts where a child has become sickly, and they've sent for the fairy expert, who has, in one account, he had actually physically beat the child, dragged him out of bed, dragged him across the courtyard, doing all of these bizarre treatments to him because he thought he was going to beat the fairy out of him. And there was another case, a husband was under arrest because he had killed his wife because he said she had turned into a fairy. Now, this went to court. He was obviously convicted of it, but was seen in a much more sympathetic light because they had tried to get the fairy out of her. So it's, these cases actually went before judges.
Well, now, when you say that the fairy was in them, it sounds like what we would consider in the United States a demonic possession. Do the fairy folk possess humans? Is that the idea? Is that one of their magical aspects?
Not so much that I know of. And in fact, the changeling was where they swapped them, so they would swap over. But this person that I've been speaking to in Louisiana, I actually asked him yesterday because I was going to be doing this show, and I thought I must get back to him. I've got a couple more questions, because when somebody tells you that they see them all around you, of course, there are millions of questions you could ask them. And I said to him, are they aware, the fairies that he says that he interacts with, and they're with him 24 hours a day? I said, I want you to find out, are they, do they believe in demons? Do demons exist? And they're separate things. He said, they don't know where they come from, but they're completely different beings. And in fact, this man had contacted me because he'd heard me on a radio show, and we were talking about fairies, and I said I was on a different show in which the host was a psychic, and she berated me, really, because she said, you're romanticizing the fairies, but she said from my psychic interactions with them, they're very dark. They can be very dark. And she said, so you shouldn't think that they're glamorous and it's all happiness. Well, Shane had contacted me because he heard that, and he said, I really want you to understand that the ones that interact with me are nothing but good. So, he's sort of speaking up for them and saying, please don't put them in this negative light that they do these things to people.
Well, could it be that there are different races of these beings, and some are more malevolent and territorial, some are more benevolent and fancy-free? I mean, could that be part of the mystery of this whole enigma?
Well, I don't know. In his case, he said it began for him in 2011 at his property, and for some reason he had got some kind of dark attachment. So I don't know whether he meant demonic or poltergeist, and he was on the point of wanting to move home because it was so bad. So he went to see somebody who was a medium, and in the course of their interaction, he began asking her questions, and one of which was that he wanted to know the answer to was, do fairies really exist? And she told him a way that he could contact them and interact with them. Now, I don't know what that way was, but he said after 20 days of doing this, they suddenly appeared in his house. Now, the way he describes it, again, makes you think it's true in some regard, because he said he was actually in the bathroom when it happened, and he said, I didn't really want my privacy invaded, but these creatures just turned up. Yeah, and he said maybe they did it because they knew I couldn't escape, because they'd all turned up, and and the way he said that they were tiny little creatures and they were staring at him. Some were hanging in the doorway, and one of them came closer. He was only a few inches tall, had a long pointy nose, and he stuck his head in Shane's face, literally, that close, and he was really freaked out by it. And so he said to them, look, please give me some privacy. And he said they reluctantly kind of sloped off, looking really upset, and they went into the living room. And when he came out, they were circling the fan on the ceiling. They're just flying and jumping along the top of the sofa, along the top of it, and leaping into the air. And he said he's never been so overjoyed by what he saw. And since that day, they've been with him. And so, of course, I've wanted to know what they look like. And he said, well, they don't have this really bright colour to them. So they're almost a ghostly sort of outline, apart from at night. And then you can see their faces and you can see the shape of them. So they would be from 2 or 3 inches upwards in size. But he said they're energy beings, so they're a neon white, blue kind of colour, but because they're energy spirits. And I said to him, well, how do you communicate with them? And he said, well, it's taken me a few years now. It's almost like a telepathic communication. But he said he sees them and they communicate with each other by really gesticulating a lot. So even though it's telepathic, they're actually having these really heated conversations. And I said, well, do they get upset? Do they have the same kind of feelings as us? And he said the only time I've seen one upset was when she recognised me, he said, from what he thinks was a past life, and that he died in a bad way. So, but anyway, he said none of them ever really get upset. They have heated conversations, but they spend the majority of their time flying around, swinging from places. They love the water, so they're normally in the bath. But he said, I'll give you one example of why it sounds to me like he's not just making it up, is because he described a time he was in the bathroom, and he said, I looked at the door, and the doorstop, he said there were these 2 minute figures, and they were dancing what looked like a waltz, but they were going round and round and round, and they didn't stop. But he said they were defying gravity, because they weren't on top of the doorstop, they were at the side of it, so they were at a 45-degree angle, but dancing that way, defying gravity. But he has described that so there's the fairies, the ones that you would imagine are like the gnomes or the elves or the pixies. But he said there's unicorns, there's dragons, there's salamanders. He said he's had interaction with Sasquatch as well, but they're interdimensional. They're not of the same energy at all. But he said there's dragons being protectors, not scary monsters. And I said, well, what do they all do? And he said, well, mainly they play. He said they like to have, relations with each other a lot. He said that one thing they do is that if there's been a natural disaster, they do go off to that place and they clean up the energy around it. But he said, in terms of size, he has seen things that are 20 feet in the air. And he's seen them in the fields, so that they'll turn up. And he said that they can instantaneously go from one place to the next because they are so fast. And he describes it as because they're vibrating at such a high energy. And these creatures, he said he's seen a dragon, but it can walk as a human as well. Wow. So, of course, to anybody listening, it sounds completely,
mad,
insane.
Right.
But not if you've seen it yourself. And the reason, again, he was contacting me was to say, look, I've heard you say, that they make people disappear and they steal them and all of this. He said, but I interact with these beings and I really don't want you to paint them in this light, because he said they want to be better known.
Sure.
Now, and I said, well,
I'll tell you what, Steph, let's
to any of us.
Let's keep discussing this. We've got to take a quick break. We'll continue. Steph Young, as we've talked about some more of the fantastic side of fairy lore. When we come back, some of the dark legends of elementals and fairy folk and mysterious disappearances around the world. How far back do these disappearances date? We'll talk about that and more when we return to Beyond the Darkness.
Beyond the darkness.
Welcome back to Beyond the Darkness. I'm your host, Dave Schrader, and tonight we're talking about mysterious disappearances, the dark legends of elementals and fairy folk. Our guest is Steph Young. Tomorrow we're back, scientific support of reincarnation with Mark Anthony, and later on this week, Neil Story joins us, The Book of the Dead, Bizarre Rituals and Hauntings with Neil Story. That's what's on tap for this week. So keep checking out podcast1.com and make sure you subscribe over on iTunes. And if you are listening on iTunes, do me a huge favor. Just go in and rate and review the show. Every time somebody subscribes and rates and reviews the show, it helps us to build our audience and make our Army of Darkness even larger. So please give us this hand. Go over to iTunes and subscribe now to Beyond the Darkness, which, as I said, is now 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And remember, if you like what you're hearing on the show and you want to dip deeper into these topics and you want to read the books from our guests, then here's what you can do. We know Amazon is the biggest online mall in the universe. So what you can do is use Amazon and it will help keep this podcast going. That's right. If you use my Amazon banner when you shop, there's a small amount of the purchase that goes directly to supporting this podcast, and that happens at no extra cost to you at all. Just go over to podcast1.com, click on the Killer Deals link, then click my show logo. You'll see Beyond the Darkness, the little ghost with the microphone, and you'll see Amazon and all my sponsors there. So make sure you visit all of the sponsors because that goes a long way to help us stay on the air as well. But when you go to Amazon through my link, you'll be able to bookmark it, so it's super easy to use the next time you go to Amazon.com, and it's a cool way that you can help us continue doing Beyond the Darkness and making us a part of your world. So thank you very much for that. All right, we're back. Steph Young. We're discussing the kind of fairy folk legend and lore, and we're hearing from somebody that you're talking to recently that he has interacted with these fairies, that they are in a very kind, playful, more magical way that we would assume them to be. But then you heap onto it that he claims he sees unicorns and dragons, and you know, where we might start buying into the fact that he's tapped into this mystical realm of fairies. When you start talking unicorns and dragons, did you have to steady yourself back and think, wait, what?
No, not really, no. Because if fairies exist, why couldn't dragons exist? So no. And interestingly, because he said I'd like to send you the photographs that I've been able to take. He said, but I don't know if it's safe. And he said he knows he is being monitored, and he doesn't know if I'm being monitored because the fairy said it's not safe to send them at the moment, but it may be. And he said that he knows some military people, now retired, who were trained in a special unit to deal with, now I don't know what he means by deal with or interact or study this phenomena, because I said, could their abilities be harnessed by humans? Could we use some of their abilities? And he says he doesn't think that's possible. But he seems to say that military, government, whoever, is aware of these creatures and keeps a keen eye on them.
Wow. All right.
Yeah.
That just sounds completely crazy to me. But again, I don't live that life. I don't see these things. Did it happen once he opened up this realm? Once he opened himself to this, he started seeing this. Did they bring through these other creatures? And did you refer to them, or did he refer to them as like interdimensional creatures?
He said that the little people and Sasquatch are interdimensional, more flesh and blood, but the fairies, the fae, are ethereal bodies. So he likens it to how when a person dies, their body goes, but their spirit continues. So he says that that's what they're made of. Not that they were human, but that's how he compares it to. So how we may exist after bodily death, and our mind can continue without our brain, that's sort of set up.
Well, let's delve into the darker aspect of this. And I know there are places that if you cross fairy circles, you will vanish. And some people have done that and claim to have made their way back out again. Now, is this more of the dark side, or do you think it's really nothing to do with evil or dark side? It's just that you're entering their territory, and sometimes we stumble into these mystical realms, and that is just what it is.
Well, I do think it might be just we accidentally go into it. Not everybody ends up dead or taken away. In fact, a man from the San Juan Islands contacted me because this was about 3 years ago, and he had had a very strange experience after walking inside a fairy ring of mushrooms. And again, his story is very outlandish.
Did he happen to eat any of those mushrooms?
No. But what happened to him was he went home feeling a bit disoriented, went to bed, which is something he doesn't do in the daytime, got up later that day and just felt different. And in fact, he said that he works for himself, and he was looking for a new office to rent, and there was a new development being put up. So he drove over to where this was being put up, and he saw these people that he said looked like soldiers with guns, all in black. And then the next thing you know, he talks to them and says, I'm interested in, can I go inside? I'd like to see if I can lease an office. And they just said, you've got to go now. He gets back in his car, and as he's driving away, he looks in the mirror. They've turned into garbage bags, black trash bags. And he said, I asked a very, very well-esteemed investigative journalist who's a friend of mine to go to that office building place and see for himself, and they had a very similar experience. And he said, this man is completely rational, but it happened to him. And it was almost like he was being put into a different time and place, because he was seeing things that happened in the future that happened several months after the day that he was having these experiences. And but that's the thing. I do have a few accounts of very strange experiences now.
Well, let's. I want to start talking about those. How far back in time do these occurrences take place that you're actually able to find documentation for?
Well, a reverend called Robert Kirk, the Secret Commonwealth of Fairies back in 1640, and he believed that they were these ethereal bodies, and he believed they were in a realm between angels and humans. But the very strange thing about him was that he had his own mysterious disappearance, it seems. The legend goes that, and Walter Scott wrote about this in his book Demonology, the legend is that he himself disappeared after death, because he died suddenly, and his wife was pregnant, and after he died, he came back in spirit and appeared as a ghost and said to somebody who was a seer, he said to him, if you go and tell a kinsman of mine, my cousin Graham of Dutchray, that I'm being held captive in fairyland and I have only one more chance to be freed. And the ghost goes on to say that he would make one more appearance, and his appearance would be at the christening of his own baby. He said, I'll appear then, and you must tell my cousin that if he throws a knife over my head as I appear, then I will be restored to society. And this will be my last opportunity to come back. Well, then the christening went ahead, and the cousin, Dutchray, was there, and the ghost of this reverend appeared, but the cousin was so taken aback by it and so shocked that he wasn't quick enough to throw the knife, and in fact he couldn't bring the Reverend back. Well, the thing is, when they later checked his grave was empty. So, I don't know where he's gone.
Right. That's all right. So that story happens, but is this in a book of fantasy? Is this in a book of other things that we know to be true, so that we can say this wasn't just a book of fairy tales that was written by a bored gentleman, but it was an actual account and stories that were collected that do note other historical significant points?
Well, Reverend Kurt himself wrote the book The Secret Commonwealth of Fairies, so he wrote a study about fairy sightings. And then Sir Walter Scott, who wrote very serious books about demonology and witchcraft, then chronicled the Reverend's disappearance from his grave. With all of these, you're going to have to take it with a grain of salt. But yes, it was chronicled, as was a pamphlet that was distributed in 1678 that's now in the British Museum. And that held a story by a man called Dr. Moore. And this was later witnessed by 2 or 3 different people, and they said that they would go to the courts to testify that this very thing happened. So in terms of it being true, well, again, I don't know, but you've got several witnesses that were willing to go to court to prove in front of a judge that they say it happened, they believe it happened. Well, in Dr. Moore's case, he was a schoolmaster in London, and he'd bought a property, an estate, in Ireland. So he went with 2 of his friends because they wanted to have a look around the estate he'd bought. And that evening, it was in the county of Wicklow, they decided to go to an inn for supper and stay the night at the inn. Well, the doctor had said, and he was regaling his friends with this, he said, I grew up around here, and I used to kept being taken by the fairies. And his very educated friends were obviously debating this and saying, well, of course you didn't. We don't believe that for a second. Well, the story goes that the doctor was then lifted off of his feet and was up in the air, and then his 2 friends grabbed hold of him. But no matter how hard they held on to him, they couldn't prevent him from being dragged out of the pub by invisible things. Well, after he'd disappeared, the 2 friends went up to the innkeeper and explained what had happened, and he was quite calm about it. And he said, well, let's summon the wise woman who lives not far away, and she'll come to the pub. And so she came, and she said a series of spells and incantations, and she described where the doctor was. And she said that at first he'd been taken to a fort by a troop of soldiers on horses, and that when he was at the fort, he was being offered food and drink. But she said that she had put some kind of spell on him, which meant he wouldn't be able to have any of the food or drink. From the fort, he would then be taken to somewhere where they would all be dancing. And when he arrived at this place, there would be about 500 of them. Well, she said he would be sent back in the morning, and he would survive the night. Well, about 6 o'clock the next morning, there's a knock on the inn door, and it's the doctor. And he starts to explain what happened to him, and he says, did you not see the troop of soldiers that pulled me out? And they gave me a big white horse, and we rode through the forest, and we went to a fort, and I was encouraged to eat and drink at the banquet. But the funny thing was, every time I tried, it was almost as though it was taken from my hands. And then we went to this dance, and we danced all night, and then I found myself back here. So he described exactly what the wise woman had said he would be doing and where he would be going. But his 2 friends were so sceptical, and they said, well, take us to where you went. So they got on horseback, and the doctor took them exactly 7 miles away to where they'd been. And when they got there, the 2 friends said that the grass was trampled down so heavily, as though this huge party of people had been there that night. And again, they said, we're willing to go in front of the judge and testify that this very thing happened. And it was distributed in this pamphlet. So, I don't know if it really happened, but they certainly said they believed it did.
So in some of these cases where the disappearance and reappearance occurs, it wasn't anything negative. It was just a weird experience.
No, apart from the fact that apart from that he was exhausted because he just was dancing all night. But no, he came back fine. No real harm done to him, no. But actually, there's another book that was written in 1865, so a couple of centuries later, and this was about the traditions of Cornwall, which has always had a really strong superstition in terms of witchcraft and enchantment in Cornwall. This book, The Droll's Tradition, has many stories, and one of them is about the pixies of Dartmoor. Dartmoor is a big national park. And in this case, it talks about how the pixies could disguise themselves and appear to look like bundles of rags. And it talks about a case where a woman was going home over the moor and she had a babe in arms and 2 other children walking with her. Well, when she got back home, and it was dark, so it was nighttime. When she got back home, she realised that one of the children who was walking with her had disappeared. So her neighbours and her got the lanterns, and immediately they set out on the moors to look for the child. Well, they found him sitting under a tree, a large oak tree, and they said, well, this was well known to be a favourite haunt of the pixies. Well, the little boy said that he'd been led away by these bundles of rags, but that they had disappeared once the lanterns had been seen on the moor. They disappeared. And there was another tale about something called the Spriggans. And in fact, I was reading that, I think it was Stephen King wrote a short story about the Spriggans based on, there's actually a sculpture in London. They're a little bit like the god Pan. They look a bit like him. And the Spriggans, in fairy lore, the story was that there was a man and he had heard that there was rumours of gold hidden on a hillside on the moors. And so he went out one night on a full moon to the hillside. And he took a spade with him, and as he started digging, he said that the clouds came over the moon, so it threw him into pitch darkness, and the wind came up, and it was roaring around him on this crag. And he said that he could hear the most awful crashes of thunder, and then as the lightning flashed, he could see these creatures coming out of the rocks, like swarming around him. So the Spriggans were a breed that could apparently sort of take you off. And he described them as so ugly that they looked as if they would eat him. But somehow he did make his escape, but he went straight to bed and he didn't get up for months and months because he was so frightened.
The idea that these creatures seem to exist, and one of the things I thought was funny when we were in Ireland and we started asking about the leprechauns, they thanked Walt Disney for that. They said there really was no leprechaun lore before Darby O'Gill and the Little People, kind of made it that way. There's always been belief and an understanding in Little People, these little different sprites, fairies, leprechauns, whatever you want to call them, but that the leprechaun as we know it today was never part of their culture. As a matter of fact, when you go to Ireland to their leprechaun museum, they have like boxes of Lucky Charms and posters from Darby O'Gill and the Little People, and it's kind of like, oh, this is where our history started with leprechauns. That to me is funny, and look how quickly people started to buy into that. Now you hear there are darker stories of the leprechauns being very temperamental and angry, and if you try to take the gold at the end of the rainbow or wherever they've hidden it, it can incite violent attacks. So here we've taken something that Disney created again and suddenly turned it into something dark. I wonder if people are just so fascinated by taking the beautiful and trying to make it something more frightening, and if that's why some of these stories turn into these darker characters, if you will, darker character images. When we talk about elementals, one quick question: when we talk about elementals and the Fae or the fairy people, the Little People, are they one and the same, or again, is that two different aspects of the paranormal, two different races, if you will?
I think they're all the same kind of energy spirits, supposedly. So I think they're all the same, but they have different appearances.
And what exactly do we understand about...
I don't really know.
What do we understand about elementals? What, from my understanding and watching some of the different shows and documentaries on it, it seems those do have a much nastier attitude.
Well, the strange thing is, when I was looking at elementals, there's a castle called Lep Castle in Ireland.
Right.
Now, they describe the being there that supposedly makes an appearance as being an elemental, and yet the history of that castle suggests that it's more of a demonic or ghostly creature than a nature spirit, because the history that they used to throw their enemies and also mercenaries down into a pit, because when it was excavated they found hundreds of skeletons. So that is supposed to be haunted by what they call an elemental. But that doesn't seem to be a nature spirit at all. I would say that's more of a ghost or a demonic thing. I think the term elemental can be used in different ways. I kind of understood it as being more of a nature spirit myself.
Right.
But I've got a couple of really dark sort of fairy stories as well. Because what I was going to say was, I think a lot of times the folklore side of it was to keep children from misbehaving, kind of like you say,
right.
The werewolf, the loup-garou in New Orleans. You might say, well, yeah, that's just to keep the kids from going out and playing late and getting into trouble, which I think perhaps is what the fairy lore was used for as well. But there's one particular story about Netta Fornario, who went to the Isle of, on the Hebrides, Isle of Iona, and that was a true story. Ended up dying in the most strange way, and fairy disappearances there.
Okay, don't leave me hanging. What happened?
Okay. Well, Nettie was in London in the early 1900s, Nettie Fornario, and she was being brought up by her grandparents because her parents had died. Well, she was highly intelligent, that's how she was described, and in fact she used to write for the Occult Review. And she joined the Alpha and Omega. The Samuel Mathers founded it after being kicked out of the Golden Dawn. So Aleister Crowley and Samuel Mathers were in the Golden Dawn, and they used to fight. And apparently they used to have astral battles. So Mathers would summon a vampire, and Crowley would summon a host of demons. So they were both kicked out. Samuel Mathers founded his order, and 30 years later, Nettie joined this because her only interest really seemed to be in whether it was because she wanted to contact her deceased parents, but she was obsessed with the supernatural and the paranormal and with fairies and that realm. Because at one point she'd gone to see an opera, and she'd seen it 20 times at least, and the opera was about the fairies. And it was written by a man who was Scottish, and he wrote as a female pen name, and he had been brought up on an island called Iona in the Hebrides, just off Scotland. So she'd seen this opera, and she'd commented in the Occult Review, she was remonstrating that the writer of the opera, who'd based it on this man's book, had left out a lot to do with the fairies because it was about them, and left out the bit about trying to contact them in the astral world. So she decided to go and live there, and she took lodgings with a family, and they described later that it was almost as though she spent all of her time going out on the moor at night. Now, this was an island that had very few people living on it. They had no electricity, and it was only 7 miles long, and it was very barren. And so she used to roam on the moors at night and then come home, spend all day in her room and write in a journal. But the family began to get concerned because it appeared that her nails were turning black, and her pallor had just gone so pale. Well, one day she came home and she said to the lady who ran the house, "I've got to go home, I've got to go back to London." and they couldn't understand why. And she said a terrible battle is taking place. And they thought, well, we don't understand that because nobody sent any letters for her to go back to London. And she said, I've got to go today. And they said to her, but it's Sunday and the ferry doesn't run on a Sunday. But she was so distressed, they agreed to pack up her bags, and they took the bags down to the ferry, but she had to go back to the house for the night. Well, she had this resigned look on her face, the mother said, and she sort of said to them, well, what will be now then. So she went out that night, and the next morning they didn't see her, and they didn't see her in the afternoon. And by the evening time, they were a bit concerned, so they went into her room, and she didn't seem to have slept in her bed at all, and they saw that in the fireplace she'd thrown her journal, and it had been burnt. So they believed she was missing. Well, they left it another day, and again, couldn't see anything of her. So they decided to start looking for her, and they covered all of the island, which of course was not that big, but they couldn't find her at all. They sent for the police to come, who came the next day, and everybody was looking again, and in fact it was a dog that led them to her, and she was laid out on the ground on a little hill, and she had a knife in her hand, which was in a death grip, and she was supposedly had a look of terror on her face, so she looked like she died of terror. There were no marks on her apart from very deep scratches. She had nothing on her feet, and only her toes had marks on them, so the bottoms of her feet were completely clean. So nobody could understand, if she'd been out all night, how she had completely clean feet. And a very good friend of hers called Dion Fortune, who was part of the order, sort of chimed in and said, although she was determined to have died of exposure, and in fact they put a stopped heart caused it as well. So Dion Fortune chimed in and she said, well, I kind of severed my contact with her because she was trying to contact the green rays. Well, the green rays were the elementals. So based on theosophy, you've got different levels of the astral planes.
Okay.
And Nettie was trying to contact the fairy realm astrally. And her friend said that I had to stop working with her because I believed it was too dangerous to do that. And in fact, Samuel Mathers had said, if you're trying to contact elementals, if you do one thing slightly wrong in your ritual, you'll end up dying, So she said, well, I think that she'd done that and she'd gone too far. But there's quite a bit of a twist to the story, because the man who'd written the opera and who had grown up on the island, who she was obsessed by, had one day as a child gone to find his friend. He wanted to go and play with her. So when he got to his friend's house, he couldn't see her there, and he asked her mother, and her mother said, well, she's gone, she's been taken. And he said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, she's gone to the fairy mound. And she said, well, the monks were trying to get to her. So the monks used to live on the island back in the 6th century. And in fact, very famous people wrote throughout the ages, diarists and people, used to write about how the island had angel and fairy manifestations. Well, she said that the monks had once killed a woman believing that she was a fairy. Well, fast forward to now, her daughter's gone missing, and what happened was her daughter had gone to the fairy mound believing that she would be kept safe from the monks who were after her, and this was the very mound in which Nettie, years later, was found dead. So she had somehow been killed, but nobody could work out why. So it's a true story, but nobody could work out why she'd been killed. And one investigator went there actually to do an investigation, and he sort of took accounts, and there were reportings of seeing hooded figures, there were strange lights in the sky. So there were all these different things that seemed to have been going on that night and when she disappeared, but nobody could work out really what happened. And the belief and the suggestion was that she had somehow been astrally killed by going too deeply into the astral planes to try and connect with the fairies.
Well, that'll teach you for trying to astral project where you don't belong, huh?
What? I don't know.
Now you're making it. I don't like the out of doors, and now you're making me not even want to go to bed for fear I'll astral project into the wrong place.
Well, it's very mysterious, some of these tales. There's another one that I found that was read out by a hiking group, a group who go hiking and on field trips and talk about these stories, and it was actually written back in 1887. And what happened was there was a man called Mr. Beckworth, and he lived in a county in England, and he was married. He worked in a bank, and he had gone out one night to visit a friend, and he was returning home through the countryside on his bicycle, accompanied by his dog called Strap. And it was pitch dark, but he said that the moon was quite bright, and he could even see an owl flying by quite clearly, and he could see the stones in the road, so he knew he could see everything. Well, suddenly Strap the dog darts up a hill and starts staring at something in one of the bushes, and the man's calling Strap to come back, and the dog takes no notice of him. So eventually the man realises he's going to have to go up the hill to get the dog, and he goes up the hill, and the dog is now sort of whimpering a little bit, and he won't move, but he's scared. And so the man doesn't know what to do, because he thinks, well, it's a possibility it could be somebody drunk who's fallen in a bush. I can't leave him.
Right.
So eventually, I
had a lot of nights like that in college.
You never know. Well, eventually he thinks, I'm going to have to put my hands in. So he puts his hand into this bush, because by this point all he can see is a pair of eyes looking at him. So he puts his hands in, and he pulls out this little creature. And he says it looked like it was a little girl with the palest face he's ever seen, and the neck the size of his wrist. And he thinks by the look of her face she must be about 12 or 13, but her height is absolutely tiny. So anyway, he's got her in his arms. Well, at this point, he hears somebody coming up the hill, and it turns out to be the local policeman. And the policeman's shining his torch. And so the man, Mr. Beckworth, says, I think there's been some foul play here, because I found this little girl in the bush. And the policeman starts laughing at him and starts walking back down the hill. And Mr. Beckworth thinks, oh, this is a bit strange. He realises the policeman couldn't see what he's holding. So he goes back down the hill, and he says that he puts the creature on the handlebars of the bicycle and cycles home. And his wife's at the door, and she's worried because he's really late home. So she starts talking to him and says, where have you been? And as she's doing that, she puts her hand and she leans it out and puts it on the handlebars to rest on. And Mr. Beckworth's thinking, well, how is she doing that? Her hand has gone straight through this creature. So he thinks, well, I can't tell her. So he doesn't say anything. And after his wife goes back indoors, he decides to put the creature in the dog kennel, which is outside, and it's not tiny. There's a bit of a run for the dog, and he's got another dog, which is a whippet. So the Strap, the little dog, and the big whippet and this creature, they're all put in the kennel. And the next morning he goes out and he sees that they're all playing together, but his wife can't see the creature. Well, he's got a child who's about 3 years old, and a couple of days later he's gone off to the bank, come home, just acted normally. He finds his daughter playing with this creature, and he says, well, I kept her. I kept the creature. I didn't know what else to do. She'd never eat anything, but she would just play with the dogs and with my daughter. Well, it carries on for a few weeks, and then he says, almost like he's making a confession, really, and he says, I had to tell everybody. It got into the newspapers, and the police and my employers did what they could, supported me, because one day he left the child and his child, the creature and the two dogs playing in the field, and the creature was making a wreath of flowers to put on his child's head, and he left them playing, and then about midday his wife comes to the bank and says they've disappeared. And he rushes there. They get the police, the local people, volunteers. They search every hedgerow, every field, everything, and they can't find them. They've gone. And even stranger is that there's no footprints. Some of the land was muddy. There's no mud prints. There's no trace that they were ever there. So he makes this confession and says, it's my fault entirely. If I'd have come clean, that I was keeping this creature, then it wouldn't have happened. And he said, and I believe that when she was making that wreath for my daughter's head, she was charming my daughter, and she had this planned all along. And he says, because Strap the dog, 2 days before this, was found dead in the field. And he said, when they were playing, I'd seen him, and the creature was lying on the greyhound, they were all lying in the field, and she had her arm around Strap, the little dog's neck. And he said, I thought they were just playing. He said, and the next day I came out and Strap's lying there cold and stiff, and the creature is just jumping over it like it's a piece of wood or a piece of earth. And he said, I don't understand how she didn't have any conscience that she'd killed her friend. Yeah, so...
Very weird.
Supposedly again,
now,
true story.
In more of the contemporary vanishings, do we have strange aspects that follow through? I know that there's some of the stories where these hikers or people will go vanish in the woods, and they're found later, and their feet are completely clean. They're not wearing shoes. It's not like they've been out walking around in the muck and mire that they've been in for all this time. Some we've even heard of have had strange small bite marks that they can't really determine what the hell's been nibbling on these people. With these kind of contemporary accounts, do they seem to fit into these kind of weirder realms of the fairy and elemental lore for when the vanishing occurs?
Well, they could do. It's just one possibility. They could do. And yet some of the UK disappearances...
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, you've done a lot of research. You've collected a lot of stories on these topics. Do you notice, is there a pattern with how these people vanish? Well, is it a specific time of month, year, the way that these more bizarre patterns take place?
Well, I've looked at the patterns in terms of a different topic, really, in terms of these college-age men going missing. There's a clear pattern in those ones. I haven't applied a pattern to this. I've more looked at, as I said, about whether there's a reason why it can't be explained. So if there's not a normal autopsy or a normal cause of death and they've disappeared, I look at it in that. I don't really look at it in terms of developing a pattern, but I look more in terms of if it's very strange, I look at what could be the possibilities. So in terms of the UK disappearances, I've come across ones that to me have more of a possibility, or one of the possibilities is that they were taken up into the sky by aliens and then dropped back down. That's the possibility. And I came across the work of a man called L.S.C. Taylor, who led me to looking into the idea of ley lines, and also quite a few researchers believe this, that ley lines have been blackened and there's some kind of a cult ritual going on in terms of people going missing, particularly younger people or children, and in terms of them being taken away for ritualistic purposes, and it's to do with the ley lines. So again, very different, the idea of fairies.
Mm-hmm. One thing, and maybe you're the perfect person to work with this on, and I know we've been looking for projects to work on together, Steph. One aspect that I would love to start researching, and with your extensive knowledge of research and digging deeper, one of the aspects I'm really fascinated in is starting to look through history of people that seem to appear out of nowhere, out of place, lost, confused, that they may have put into mental wards, anything that shows up in newspapers, and starting to look at these missing people that have, vanished without a trace, and then looking back in time at people that seem to appear out of nowhere, that have no memory, that have no idea where they were from or how they got to where they were, or maybe even were ranting and raving, and at the time they thought they were stark raving mad, and it turns out maybe there is some kind of dimensional port, some kind of shift. A lot of what we think might be happening in the world of the paranormal when it comes to things like ghosts and sightings of spirits may be through this thinning veil of we're actually seeing through time as opposed to seeing a ghost. We're sharing the same area. We're sharing the same place, and sometimes those experiences blend together. That's why the house is now considered haunted, because we saw something move through the house. Nobody ever died here. There was no reason for this place to be quote unquote haunted. But yet here we are with weird activity taking place. I think a lot of times we look at it linear, thinking it has to have happened before, when it could just be we're haunting ourselves from the future. Those things and those fleeting moments we're seeing may be somebody that is bought this house 20 years from now, and we're just crossing those veils. But I wonder, in these mysterious disappearances like this, where there is no sight or sound of them, there's no understanding. You've got these guys that are trained hikers and woodsmen and people that know the surroundings, and then they're gone. I just wonder how many times people have appeared out of place and out of time that may correlate with the people that are missing at this point in history.
Yeah, I mean, there are far less accounts of those, but I'm sure there are. It's just finding them, but there has to be some people like that I've really struggled to find them, but I'd love to find out about them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it just to me seems like that might be, and I know it sounds fantastic, and it sounds like I've been tripping through a fairy circle of mushrooms myself talking about that, but I just wonder if there are time slips, and if people are stepping back into places. We hear about those kind of cases, and we'll probably discuss that again in the future with Jeff Belanger or maybe Andrew Bashago talking about time slips. But where people will go to a building, ask for directions, maybe even get something to drink, they leave, and on their way back, pass that same building, and it's shuttered and broken down and looks like it's been closed for 50 years, only to find out that that moment was a strange nexus, a point where they seem to have walked in on a different time at that location and left, and when they return, it is as it appears right now. And I think there's got to be something to some of these more mysterious disappearances like that.
Well, I tell you, one place you should go when you come to England, you must go to the Isle of Wight, because it's called the most haunted island in the world, but it's got so many stories about people going to a pub and finding old-fashioned people inside, even old money, and feeling really unwelcomed and then leaving. And there's even a case where they've gone to the county records, because they've lived on the island all their life, this particular couple, and they can't find this pub on the land records. But they're not crazy, and they've, there's so many accounts in the Isle of Wight of this happening. Now, I don't know whether it's because it's surrounded by water and it's more magnetic, and, well, of course, David Icke lives there, and it's supposed to be a place where there's in fact, a massive concentration of ley lines underneath the ground. So perhaps there's something to that. But if there's anywhere that you can get those accounts, it's the Isle of Wight. I've spent a lot of time on there as well. I cannot believe how many accounts of this happen, time slips there.
So you're trying to convince me to go to the Isle of Wight and possibly vanish into time slips. I think, Steph, that I don't know if I should be offended or thrilled by the idea that you think I would be good for that adventure, but
no, it's just such a fascinating place,
right?
And I find it amazing that there are so many accounts of it.
Well, I'm game. Let's I'll talk to the planners and see if there's a chance to visit the Isle of Wight, and maybe if not on this trip, perhaps a future version of the trip will lead us there. You're doing a lot of research, and you touched on it briefly with the college-age men that seem to be vanishing around the United States. And I know that that's something that we want to chat with you more about in the future, because it's a very strange trend, and weird things going on, and I know you've got some unique insights and perspective on that, so I'd certainly like to visit with you again regarding that. But as we wrap up tonight's show and we talk about the dark side of these elemental and fairy lore and these mysterious disappearances, we heard a lot about the historical stories. Are there still contemporary versions of these abductions or mysterious disappearances taking place now that seem to fit into that fairy realm?
Well, I think I said earlier about Malaysia, and I think I must have said that on another show, but I was taking a lot of accounts, really, that I found last year in Malaysia and in Zimbabwe, where they put these things down to it being elementals. Now, of course, doesn't mean it is, but that's the belief that that's what's happening there. And I don't think you'll find people naturally saying in the UK or America, okay, well, definitely they've been taken by fairies. And I think, again, it's very much if you've had that experience. So we don't really talk about it as a logical explanation because we're in a contemporary world, whereas it would have been said as a reason in the years gone by. In the old days, it would have been a natural reason. But it doesn't mean it's not happening. It's an outlandish thing to say could be happening. I don't find it quite as hard to believe. But then I have a belief in, heaven and that we carry on after we die. So I find that easy to believe. But is that just me believing it? It doesn't mean it's true, So it depends on your perspective, I think.
All right. Well, we've got a lot more to explore over the coming years and time that we'll be here on Beyond the Darkness. And Steph, you are always one of my favorite guests. I look forward to talking to you again and bringing some more of these bizarre stories. Plus, you've written so many different books on many different topics. I don't want people to feel that you just write about mysterious disappearances. You've got a lot more out there. And is there a website people can go visit where they can find out about all your books and all of your research?
Yes, there is one now. It's called StephYoungAuthor.com.
StephYoungAuthor.com. We'll include that link with the podcast so that you can click it, visit her, and find out more about that. But Steph, as always, thank you so much for joining us this evening and being a part of the new podcast. We appreciate you being here.
Oh, so happy to be asked. Thank you, Dave. Always love your shows.
Well, that's it for this evening. When we come back tomorrow, we're going to talk with our guest, Mark Anthony. Is there scientific support for reincarnation? We'll find out about that, and later on in the week, the Book of the Dead, Bizarre Rituals and Hauntings. Our good friend Neil Story is here with us. This is the best in paranormal talk radio, now 5 nights a week. Make sure you stay tuned in with us right here on Beyond the Darkness.